The scream ripped through the forest like a blade, raw and human, shattering the stillness of Blackwood National Park. Jake froze, his boots sinking into the damp earth of the trail, the beam of his flashlight trembling across the gnarled pines. Sarah, his girlfriend, clutched his arm, her nails biting into his skin through his jacket. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind that hissed through the branches. The sound had come from deeper in the forest, where the trail led, where they were headed to camp for the weekend. Jake's heart pounded, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The scream lingered in his mind, sharp and wrong, like a warning carved into the air. They'd driven 3 hours from Portland to reach Blackwood, a sprawling wilderness of dense pines, jagged cliffs, and winding creeks that promised solitude. It was their spot, a place they'd hiked a dozen times before, always coming back for the quiet that swallowed the noise of the city. Sarah had picked the northern loop this time, a 20-mile trail that wound through the park's remotest corners, ending at a lookout with a view of the valley at sunrise. Jake had checked the forecast: clear skies, highs in the 60s, no chance of rain. Perfect. They'd packed light, a 2-person tent, sleeping bags, a small stove, some freeze-dried meals, and a map. The plan was simple: hike in, camp, hike out. But now, standing on the trail as the last light bled from the sky, Jake felt the forest shift, like it was holding its breath. Sarah's grip tightened. "Jake?" Her voice was small, her eyes wide, searching the shadows beyond the flashlight's beam. The scream hadn't come again, but the silence that followed was worse, heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was pressing down on them. "It's probably just an animal," Jake said, forcing his voice steady. "A cougar, maybe. Or an owl. They sound weird out here." He didn't believe it, not really. Cougars didn't scream like that, not with that kind of raw, human desperation. But he needed her to keep moving, needed to keep himself moving. Sarah nodded, her jaw tight, but she didn't let go of his arm. They started walking again, the trail narrowing as it twisted deeper into the forest. The pines loomed taller here, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the fading dusk. Jake's flashlight cut a thin path through the dark, catching glimpses of roots and rocks that seemed to shift in the shadows. The trail was rougher than he remembered, overgrown with ferns and brambles that snagged at their pants. The map in his pocket showed a clear path to a clearing by a creek, maybe 2 miles ahead, but the trail markers, small metal tags nailed to trees, were sparse, some rusted to illegibility, others gone entirely. "You sure we're on the right path?" Sarah asked, her voice low, like she didn't want the forest to hear. She was a few steps behind him now, her own flashlight sweeping the trees. Its beam jerking with every rustle in the undergrowth. "Yeah," Jake said, glancing at the compass clipped to his pack. The needle twitched, sluggish, like it couldn't decide which way was north. He tapped it, frowning. "This thing's acting weird, but the map's clear. We're fine." He didn't mention that the compass had never done this before, not in all their hikes. He didn't mention the way the air felt too thick, like it was clinging to his skin. The wind picked up, rattling the branches, carrying faint sounds, snapping twigs, rustling leaves. Jake told himself it was normal, just the forest doing what forests do. Blackwood was alive with wildlife, deer, foxes, maybe even a bear or two. But the scream replayed in his head, looping like a bad song. It hadn't sounded like an animal. It had sounded like someone in trouble. Or something. He pushed the thought down, focusing on the trail, on the crunch of his boots, on Sarah's breathing behind him. They'd been hiking for hours, the sun long gone, the sky a deep, starless black. The trail seemed to stretch longer than it should, the 2 miles to the clearing feeling like 10. Jake's legs ached, his pack heavier with every step. Sarah was quiet now, her flashlight steady but her steps uneven, like she was bracing for something to leap out of the dark. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not long," Jake said, checking the map under his flashlight. The creek was close, maybe a quarter mile. But the trail was getting harder to follow, the path choked with roots and fallen branches. He stopped to check the compass again, and this time the needle spun lazily, refusing to settle. "What the hell?" he muttered, shaking it. Sarah leaned in, her breath warm against his cheek. "Is it broken?" "No," Jake said, too quickly. "It's just the magnetic field or something. Mountains mess with it sometimes." He didn't know if that was true, but it sounded better than admitting he had no idea what was wrong. The forest was silent again, the wind dying down, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the faint trickle of water somewhere ahead. The creek. They were close. They pushed on, the trail dipping into a shallow ravine where the air grew colder, damper. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for the sky. Jake's flashlight caught something, a glint of metal on a tree. A trail marker, rusted but intact, the number 7 barely legible. Relief washed over him. "See? We're good," he said, pointing it out to Sarah. She nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond, where the beam didn't reach. The scream came again, closer this time, sharp and jagged, like someone was being torn apart. Jake's blood went cold. Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight dropping to the ground, its beam spinning wildly across the trees. "Jake," she gasped, grabbing his arm. The scream cut off as suddenly as it started, leaving a ringing silence. Jake's heart hammered, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He swung the beam around, searching the shadows, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness and the faint sound of the creek. "We should go back," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "That wasn't an animal. That was a person." "We can't," Jake said, his throat tight. "The trailhead's too far. The clearing's closer. We'll set up camp, stay safe till morning." He didn't know if he believed it, but turning back meant hours in the dark, hours with that scream echoing in their heads. Sarah didn't argue, but her eyes were wet, her hands shaking as she picked up her flashlight. They moved faster now, almost running, the trail sloping upward toward the sound of water. The forest seemed to close in, the trees leaning closer, their branches scraping against Jake's pack. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made him flinch, his mind conjuring shapes in the dark, figures watching, waiting. He told himself it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks. But the scream had been real. Too real. They reached the clearing just past midnight. It was smaller than Jake had expected, a patchy circle of dirt and grass surrounded by towering pines. The creek ran through it, a thin trickle glinting in the moonlight. Jake dropped his pack, his shoulders aching, and started setting up the tent. Sarah stood watch, her flashlight sweeping the edges of the clearing, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "You sure this is safe?" she asked as he drove the tent stakes into the ground. "Safe as anywhere out here," Jake said, his voice flat. He didn't mention the scream, didn't mention the compass, didn't mention the way the forest felt like it was watching them. They worked in silence, the tent going up quickly, the nylon walls a flimsy shield against the night. The wind picked up again, whistling through the trees, carrying faint sounds, rustling, snapping, whispering. Jake told himself it was just the forest, just the wind. But as they zipped themselves into the tent, crawling into their sleeping bags, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, circling, waiting. Sarah lay close, her body tense, her flashlight still on, draining the battery. "What if it comes back?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It won't," Jake said, but the lie tasted bitter. He kept his own flashlight on, the beam pointed at the tent's ceiling, casting faint shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. The forest was silent now, but it wasn't empty. He could feel it, a presence just beyond the clearing, watching, listening. The scream replayed in his mind, over and over, and as he lay there, eyes open in the dark, he wondered if they'd made a mistake coming here. If Blackwood wasn't just a park, but something else entirely. Something alive. Something hungry. The tent's thin walls did little to muffle the wind's eerie whistle as it swept through Blackwood National Park, carrying the faint rustle of pine needles and the distant trickle of the creek. Jake lay awake, his flashlight still on, its beam casting a pale glow across the nylon ceiling. Sarah was curled up beside him, her sleeping bag pulled tight around her shoulders, her breathing shallow and uneven. The scream they'd heard earlier on the trail lingered in Jake's mind, sharp and human, a sound that didn't belong in the forest. He tried to push it away, to focus on the familiar rhythm of setting up camp, but the unease clung to him like damp air, settling deep in his bones. They'd reached the clearing just past midnight, a small patch of dirt and grass hemmed in by towering pines, the creek glinting faintly under the moon. It wasn't what Jake had expected. The map had promised a decent campsite, but this spot felt cramped, exposed, the trees pressing in like silent sentinels. Setting up the tent had been a hurried affair, both of them moving with a quiet urgency, as if the forest was watching their every move. Sarah had kept her flashlight trained on the edges of the clearing, her beam darting from shadow to shadow, as if expecting something to step into the light. Jake had driven the tent stakes into the ground with more force than necessary, the metallic clink of the hammer echoing too loudly in the stillness. Now, inside the tent, the world outside felt too close. The wind carried sounds, snapping twigs, rustling leaves, that could have been animals, but Jake's mind kept circling back to the scream. It had come from deeper in the forest, from the direction of the trail they'd followed, and it hadn't sounded like any animal he'd ever heard. He glanced at Sarah, her face half-lit by the flashlight's glow, her eyes closed but her brow furrowed. She wasn't asleep, he knew. Neither was he. The forest was too loud, too alive, its noises weaving into a chorus that felt deliberate, like a warning. Jake shifted, the ground hard beneath his sleeping pad, and checked his watch. 1:17 a.m. They'd been in the tent for less than an hour, but it felt like days. The air inside was cold, the kind of damp chill that seeped through layers and made your bones ache. He reached for the map, unfolding it quietly so as not to disturb Sarah, though he knew she was awake. The paper crinkled softly as he traced the northern loop with his finger. The clearing was marked clearly, a small circle labeled Creek Site Number 3, about 2 miles from where they'd started. The trailhead was 6 miles back, an easy hike in daylight. But the trail had been harder to follow than he'd expected, the path overgrown, the markers sporadic. He thought of the compass, its needle twitching uselessly, and his stomach tightened. "You awake?" Sarah's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the wind. Her eyes were open now, glinting in the dim light, fixed on the tent's ceiling. "Yeah," Jake said, folding the map and tucking it back into his pack. "Just checking the route for tomorrow." "Is it still messed up?" she asked. Her voice tight. She meant the compass. He'd tried to downplay it earlier, blaming the mountains, but her question cut through his flimsy excuse. "It's fine," he lied, keeping his tone even. "We'll sort it out in the morning. Daylight makes everything easier." He didn't mention the trail markers, how some were missing or rusted beyond recognition. He didn't mention the way the path had seemed to twist, stretching longer than it should have. He didn't want to scare her more than she already was. Sarah nodded, but her eyes flicked to the tent zipper, as if checking it was still closed. "It's so quiet now," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "Too quiet." Jake listened. She was right. The wind had died down, and the forest had gone still, the rustling and snapping replaced by a heavy silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet that felt peaceful. It was the kind that made you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, its beam steady but weaker now, the battery draining faster than it should. "It's just the forest," he said, more to himself than to her. "It's always like this at night." But it wasn't. They'd camped in Blackwood before, in other seasons, other trails. The forest had always been alive with small sounds, crickets, owls, the skitter of something small in the underbrush. This was different. This was a silence that felt like it was listening back. Sarah sat up, pulling her knees to her chest. "What if it wasn't an animal?" she said, her voice trembling. "That scream, it sounded like a person. Like they were hurt." Jake's chest tightened. He'd been trying not to think about it, to keep his mind on practical things, the tent, the map, the plan for morning. But her words brought it rushing back, the scream's raw edge, the way it had cut through the night, the way it had stopped as suddenly as it started. "We don't know what it was," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Could have been anything. A hunter, maybe. Or someone messing around. In the middle of nowhere?" Sarah's eyes were wide, her flashlight now in her hand, its beam pointed at the tent's door. "Who screams like that for fun?" Jake didn't have an answer. He wanted to tell her it was nothing, that they were safe, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're okay," he said. "We're together. We'll head out at first light, be back at the car by noon." She nodded, but her hand was cold, her fingers trembling. She didn't let go of the flashlight, and neither did he. They sat there, side by side, listening to the silence, waiting for something to happen. The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last, the tent's walls seeming to close in. Jake's eyes kept drifting to the zipper, half expecting it to slide open on its own. Then it came, a sound, faint but unmistakable. A crunch, like a footstep on pine needles, just outside the clearing. Jake's heart lurched. He flicked his flashlight toward the tent's wall, the beam useless against the nylon. Sarah's breath caught, her hand tightening around his. Another crunch, slower, deliberate, like something was moving through the grass. Jake held his breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer now, circling the tent. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice barely a breath. "What's that?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind raced, trying to rationalize it, a deer, a raccoon, a branch falling in the wind. But the steps were too heavy, too measured. He grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, just enough to shine the beam outside. The light cut through the dark, sweeping across the clearing, catching the glint of the creek, the sway of the pines. Nothing. The grass was undisturbed, the trees still. But the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm. "Who's there?" Jake called, his voice louder than he meant, echoing in the silence. The footsteps stopped. Sarah's hand was on his arm, pulling him back, her eyes wide with fear. He zipped the tent shut, his hands shaking, and turned off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. The silence returned, thicker now, pressing against the tent like a physical weight. They didn't sleep. They sat there, clutching their flashlights, listening for the footsteps to come again. The wind picked up, rattling the trees, but the crunching didn't return. Jake's mind churned, replaying the scream, the footsteps, the compass's lazy spin. He thought of the trail, how it had seemed to stretch, how the markers had vanished. He thought of the clearing, how it felt too small, too exposed, like a stage set for something to happen. Sarah's voice broke the silence, so soft he almost missed it. "What if we're not alone out here?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The forest answered for him, its silence deeper, darker, like it was waiting for them to make the next move. The silence inside the tent was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of Sarah's trembling breath and the distant trickle of the creek outside. Jake gripped his flashlight, its beam long since dimmed, the battery teetering on the edge of death. The footsteps they'd heard, slow, deliberate crunches circling the clearing, had stopped after he'd called out, but the absence of sound didn't bring relief. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting, watching. Sarah's hand was still on his arm, her fingers cold and rigid, her eyes fixed on the tent's zipper as if it might slide open at any moment. The scream from earlier that night, raw and human, echoed in Jake's mind, mingling with the memory of those footsteps, each one heavier than the last, like something was stalking them just beyond the nylon walls. They'd been in Blackwood National Park for less than a day, but it felt like weeks. The clearing they'd chosen as their campsite, marked on the map as Creek Site Number 3, was supposed to be a safe haven, a flat patch of dirt and grass by a trickling stream. But it felt wrong, too small, too exposed, the towering pines leaning in like they were listening. Jake had tried to dismiss the scream as an animal, the compass's sluggish needle as a quirk of the mountains, but the footsteps were harder to explain. They weren't the skittering of a deer or the shuffle of a raccoon. They were purposeful, measured, like someone, or something, was pacing the perimeter of their camp. Jake's watch read 2:43 a.m., the numbers glowing faintly in the dark. He hadn't dared turn the flashlight back on, not after the footsteps stopped. The darkness felt safer somehow, like keeping the light off might hide them from whatever was out there. Sarah hadn't spoken since her whispered question, her words hanging between them, "What if we're not alone out here?" Jake wanted to reassure her, to say it was nothing, but his throat was dry, his heart thudding too loud in his chest. He kept replaying the moment he'd unzipped the tent, shining the flashlight into the clearing, seeing nothing but grass and trees. The emptiness had been worse than finding something. It made him feel like they were being toyed with. A faint rustle came from outside, so soft it could have been the wind. Jake's grip on the flashlight tightened, his thumb hovering over the switch. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes wide, glinting in the faint glow from his watch. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He listened, straining to pick out the sound again. The wind was back, a low moan through the pines, but beneath it was something else, a faint crunch, like a single step on dry leaves. Then another. Slow, deliberate, moving along the edge of the clearing. Jake's stomach twisted. He wanted to believe it was an animal, but the rhythm was wrong, too steady, too human. He flicked on the flashlight, the beam weak but sharp, and pointed it at the tent's wall. The light didn't penetrate the nylon, but it cast their shadows in stark relief, making the tent feel even smaller. "Don't," Sarah hissed, grabbing his wrist. "What if it sees us?" Jake froze, her words sinking in. He turned off the flashlight, plunging them back into darkness. The footsteps continued, circling closer now, the crunch of pine needles distinct against the wind's hum. Jake's mind raced, trying to piece together what could be out there. A hiker? A hunter? But who would be wandering Blackwood in the dead of night, circling a campsite without a word? He thought of the scream again, that desperate, tearing sound, and his blood ran cold. What if it hadn't been a cry for help? What if it was something else entirely? The footsteps stopped, so abruptly Jake thought he'd imagined them. He held his breath, waiting, counting the seconds. 10. 20. Nothing. Sarah's hand was still on his wrist, her nails digging in, her breath shallow and ragged. "Is it gone?" she whispered, so quiet he barely heard her. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice low. He didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. The silence was back, thick and heavy, like a weight pressing on his chest. He kept the flashlight off, his eyes straining to see through the dark, as if he could will the tent's walls to become transparent. The air inside was cold, damp, the kind of chill that settled into your bones and stayed there. He could feel Sarah trembling beside him, her body curled tight, her flashlight clutched like a weapon. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Jake's watch ticked to 3:15 a.m., but time felt meaningless in the dark. The forest stayed silent, but it wasn't empty. He could feel it, a presence just beyond the clearing, waiting. He thought of the trail they'd taken to get here, how it had seemed to stretch, how the markers had been rusted or missing. He thought of the compass, its needle spinning lazily, refusing to point north. He thought of the scream, and now the footsteps, and a cold certainty settled over him. They weren't alone. Sarah shifted, her sleeping bag rustling softly. "We should leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Now. Before it comes back." Jake shook his head, though she couldn't see it. "It's too dark. We'd get lost. The trail's hard enough to follow in daylight." He didn't add that he wasn't sure they could find the trail at all, not with the way it had twisted, the markers vanishing like they'd never been there. He didn't add that he was afraid of what they'd find if they left the tent, afraid of what might be waiting in the dark. "Then what do we do?" Sarah's voice cracked, her fear spilling out. "Just sit here and wait for it to come for us?" "It's not coming for us," Jake said, but the words felt hollow. He reached for her hand, finding it cold and clammy. "We stay put. We stay quiet. At first light, we pack up and go. Straight to the trailhead. We'll be out by noon." Sarah didn't respond, but her hand squeezed his, hard. They sat there, side by side, listening to the silence, waiting for the footsteps to return. The wind picked up again, rattling the pines, but it carried no other sounds, no crunching, no rustling, no screams. Jake's eyes burned from staring into the dark, his muscles aching from tension. He kept the flashlight in one hand, the other wrapped around Sarah's, both of them frozen in place. Then it came again, a single, heavy crunch, right outside the tent. Jake's heart stopped. Sarah's breath caught, her hand tightening until it hurt. The sound was close, too close, just beyond the nylon wall. Jake's thumb found the flashlight switch, but he didn't press it. He didn't want to see. Another crunch, slower, like whatever was out there was taking its time. It moved along the tent's edge, the sound scraping against Jake's nerves, each step louder than the last. He leaned toward Sarah, his lips brushing her ear. "Don't move," he whispered, so quiet he wasn't sure she heard. She nodded, her body rigid, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The footsteps circled again, completing a full loop around the tent before stopping near the zipper. Jake's pulse roared in his ears, drowning out everything else. He stared at the zipper, waiting for it to move, for the tent to rip open, for something to burst through. But nothing came. The footsteps faded, the silence returning like a tide. Jake didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't let go of Sarah's hand. They stayed like that until the first gray light of dawn crept through the tent's walls, the forest outside still and silent, as if nothing had ever been there. But Jake knew better. Whatever had circled their tent wasn't gone. It was waiting. The first rays of dawn filtered through the tent's thin walls, casting a pale, grayish light that did little to warm the chill in Jake's bones. He hadn't slept, not after the footsteps that had circled their campsite in the dead of night, their heavy, deliberate crunch fading into silence just before sunrise. Sarah sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest, her flashlight still clutched in her hand, its battery long dead. The scream they'd heard on the trail, raw and human, and the footsteps that followed, felt like a weight pressing down on them, heavier now in the quiet of morning. The forest outside was still, the towering pines of Blackwood National Park standing like silent sentinels, their branches swaying faintly in the early breeze. But the stillness wasn't comforting. It felt like the calm before a storm, a pause before something worse. Jake's watch read 5:47 a.m. His muscles ached from sitting rigid for hours, his eyes burning from staring into the dark, waiting for the footsteps to return. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't spoken since the last crunch outside the tent, but her hand still gripped his, her fingers stiff and cold. The tent smelled of damp nylon and fear, the air thick with the memory of the night. Jake wanted to say something, to break the silence, but words felt useless. The forest had answered Sarah's question, what if we're not alone out here, with those footsteps, with the oppressive quiet that followed? We need to move, Jake said finally, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Get packed and go. Trailhead 6 miles back. We can be at the car by noon. Sarah nodded, her movements jerky as she released his hand and reached for her pack. They worked in silence, dismantling the tent with practiced efficiency, though every rustle of nylon made Jake flinch, his eyes darting to the edges of the clearing. The creek's trickle was louder now, a steady murmur that should have been soothing but instead felt like a taunt, a reminder of how exposed they were. The clearing looked different in the daylight, smaller, more open, the grass patchy and uneven, the pines less menacing but still too close. Jake folded the tent, stuffing it into its bag, while Sarah rolled their sleeping pads, her hands shaking slightly. He glanced at the map, spread out on the ground, its edges curling in the damp morning air. The northern loop was clearly marked, a thin red line looping through the forest, with Creek Site Number 3 circled in black ink. The trailhead was a straight shot back, 6 miles through dense woods, past the ravine they'd crossed last night. But the trail had been harder to follow than expected, the path overgrown, the metal markers rusted or missing. Jake's compass, clipped to his pack, caught his eye. He picked it up, hoping the daylight would fix whatever had made it spin lazily the night before. The needle twitched, sluggish, refusing to settle on north. He tapped it, shook it, but it wavered like it was caught in a tug-of-war. Still broken? Sarah asked, her voice flat as she zipped her pack. She stood by the creek, her boots sinking into the soft earth, her eyes scanning the trees. It's not broken, Jake said, though he wasn't sure. Just, acting up. We don't need it. The map's enough. He folded the map, tucking it into his pocket, but the compass's behavior gnawed at him. He'd used it on every hike they'd taken, and it had never failed before. Not like this. He slung his pack over his shoulders, the weight familiar but heavier today, and gestured for Sarah to follow. Let's go. They stepped onto the trail, the path barely visible in the morning light, overgrown with ferns and roots that seemed to twist underfoot. The forest was brighter now, the sky a pale gray through the canopy, but the light didn't reach the ground. Shadows clung to the trees, pooling in the undergrowth, making every branch look like a figure waiting to move. Jake kept his eyes on the trail, searching for the next marker, a rusted metal tag nailed to a pine. He found one after a few minutes, the number 6 barely legible, its edges eaten by rust. Relief flickered in his chest, but it was short-lived. The trail felt different, narrower, the trees closer than they'd been last night. Sarah walked behind him, her steps quiet but uneven, her flashlight still in her hand despite its dead battery. This doesn't look right, she said after a while, her voice low. The trail, it's not the same. Jake stopped, glancing back. The path behind them was a tangle of brambles and roots, the way they'd come already fading into the forest. It's the same, he said, though doubt crept into his voice. We're just tired. It looks different in the light. But he wasn't sure. The ravine they'd crossed last night should have been close, a shallow dip with a stream at the bottom, but the ground here was flat, the trees denser. He checked the map again, tracing the red line with his finger. They were on the right path. They had to be. They kept moving, the forest growing quieter as the morning wore on. The birds should have been singing, the squirrels chattering, but the only sound was their boots on the dirt and the occasional snap of a twig. Jake's skin prickled, the back of his neck tingling like he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the trees. Nothing. Just pines and shadows. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the ground, her jaw tight, her flashlight swinging uselessly at her side. They walked for an hour, maybe two, the trail twisting through the forest, the markers appearing less frequently now. Jake's legs ached, his pack digging into his shoulders, but he didn't stop. The sooner they reached the trailhead, the sooner they'd be out of Blackwood, away from the scream, the footsteps, the suffocating silence. He tried to focus on the plan, get to the car, drive back to Portland, forget this trip ever happened. But the forest seemed to fight them, the path veering left when it should have gone right, the trees closing in like walls. Sarah stopped suddenly, her hand grabbing his arm. "Jake," she said, her voice sharp. She was staring at the ground, her eyes wide. There, in the dirt, was a single footprint, not theirs. It was larger, deeper, the edges uneven like something heavy had pressed into the earth. Jake's stomach dropped. He knelt, touching the dirt, his fingers brushing the print. It was fresh, the soil still damp, the outline clear. Too big to be a hiker's boot. Too deliberate to be an animal. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, stepping back, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jake said, standing quickly. He scanned the trees, his heart pounding, but the forest was empty, the shadows still. Could be a hunter. Or another hiker. But the words felt wrong, even as he said them. No hiker would be out here, not this deep, not after that scream. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her forward. "Come on. We need to keep moving." They walked faster now, the trail sloping upward, the air growing colder as they climbed. The footprint stayed in Jake's mind, its shape burned into his memory. He didn't tell Sarah about the others he saw. Faint impressions in the dirt, scattered along the path, leading in the same direction they were going. He didn't tell her about the way the forest seemed to watch them, the silence growing heavier with every step. And he didn't tell her about the faint sound that started as they neared the top of the rise, a low, guttural whisper, carried on the wind, too faint to make out but too real to ignore. The trail leveled out, opening into a small clearing, not the one they'd camped in but similar, with a rocky outcrop at its center. Jake stopped, checking the map, his hands shaking slightly. This wasn't on the map. No clearing, no rocks, just the red line of the northern loop. Sarah stood beside him, her eyes scanning the trees, her breath coming in short bursts. "We're lost, aren't we?" she said, her voice barely audible. "No," Jake said, folding the map. "We're close. Just keep moving." But as they stepped into the clearing, the whisper grew louder, a single word forming in the wind: "Stay." The whisper lingered in the air, a single word, "Stay," carried on the wind that swept through the unfamiliar clearing in Blackwood National Park. Jake's heart thudded, his hand tightening around the map as he stood frozen, the rocky outcrop in the center of the clearing casting jagged shadows in the pale morning light. Sarah stood beside him, her breath shallow, her eyes darting from the trees to the ground, where the strange footprint they'd found earlier seemed to burn into the dirt. The forest was silent again, the whisper gone, but its echo clung to Jake's skin like damp mist. The trail they'd been following, already treacherous with its missing markers and twisting paths, had led them here, to a place that wasn't on the map, a place that felt like a trap. They'd been hiking since dawn, fleeing the cramped clearing where they'd camped, where the scream and circling footsteps had kept them awake through the night. The trailhead was supposed to be 6 miles back, an easy escape to their car and the safety of Portland, but the forest seemed to fight them at every step. The compass was useless, its needle spinning lazily, and the trail markers, rusted metal tags nailed to pines, had all but vanished. Jake's legs burned, his pack digging into his shoulders, but stopping wasn't an option. Not after the scream. Not after the footsteps. Not after the footprint, too large and too deliberate to belong to any hiker. Sarah's voice broke the silence, low and trembling. "We're not supposed to be here." She was staring at the rocky outcrop, its surface pitted and gray, like it had been carved by something other than time. Her flashlight, dead since the night, hung uselessly from her belt, but her hand hovered near it, as if it could still protect her. Jake folded the map, his fingers stiff from the cold. "We're fine," he said, though the lie tasted bitter. "We just missed a turn. The trailhead's close." He didn't believe it, not with the way the forest seemed to shift around them, the path behind them swallowed by ferns and brambles. He gestured toward the edge of the clearing, where the trail supposedly continued. "Let's keep going." Sarah didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, a few feet from the outcrop. "Jake," she whispered, pointing. There, half buried in the dirt, was a boot. Not theirs. It was a hiking boot, like Sarah's, but older, the leather cracked and caked with mud, the laces frayed to threads. It sat at an odd angle, like it had been dropped or abandoned, its sole worn to a thin sliver. Jake's stomach lurched. He stepped closer, crouching to examine it, careful not to touch. The dirt around it was disturbed, scuffed, like something had been dragged away. "What is that?" Sarah's voice was barely audible, her hands clenched into fists. She backed away, her boots sinking into the soft earth. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. The boot was too familiar, too much like the ones they wore, but its condition told a story he didn't want to hear. It looked like it had been out here for months, maybe years, left behind by someone who hadn't made it out. He stood, wiping his hands on his pants, though he hadn't touched the boot. "It's nothing," he said, forcing his voice steady. "Just, someone lost it. Happens all the time." Sarah's eyes were wide, her face pale. "Out here? In the middle of nowhere?" She shook her head, stepping back further. "That's not normal, Jake. None of this is normal." He wanted to argue, to tell her it was just a coincidence, but the words wouldn't come. The boot wasn't alone. As his eyes scanned the clearing, he saw more signs, faint scuff marks in the dirt, a broken twig, a patch of grass flattened like something heavy had rested there. And the footprints. More of them, larger than the one they'd found earlier, scattered along the edge of the clearing, leading toward the trees. They were uneven, some deeper than others, like whatever made them was dragging something behind it. Jake's pulse quickened, his mind racing to explain it away, a hunter, a bear, anything. But nothing fit. "We need to go," he said, grabbing Sarah's arm. She flinched at his touch, her eyes still on the boot, but she nodded, falling into step behind him. They moved quickly, leaving the clearing behind, the trail picking up where the footprints ended. The path was narrower now, choked with roots and vines that seemed to grab at their boots. The trees loomed closer, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the weak sunlight. Jake kept his eyes on the ground, searching for markers, but the metal tags were gone, replaced by bare trunks and shadows that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. The forest was quiet, too quiet, the usual chatter of birds and squirrels absent. The only sounds were their footsteps, the rustle of their packs, and the faint whisper of the wind, which carried no words now but still felt alive, like it was watching them. Jake's compass was still useless, its needle twitching aimlessly, so he relied on the map, though its neat lines felt like a lie. The trail should have been straightforward, a clear path back to the trailhead, but every turn seemed wrong, every landmark unfamiliar. The ravine they'd crossed the night before was nowhere in sight, and the terrain was flatter, denser, like they'd wandered into a different part of Blackwood entirely. Sarah's breathing was ragged behind him, her steps faltering. "This isn't right," she said, her voice sharp with panic. "We're going in circles, Jake." "I know we are." "We're not," he snapped, though doubt gnawed at him. He stopped, pulling out the map again, his hands shaking as he traced the red line. "Look, we're here." He pointed to a spot just past the creek, though he wasn't sure. The clearing with the boot wasn't marked, and the trail's twists didn't match the map's clean curves. We're close to the trailhead. Just a few more miles. Sarah didn't respond. She was staring at the ground again, her face drained of color. Jake followed her gaze and froze. Another footprint, fresher than the last, pressed deep into the dirt. It was closer to the trail, its edges sharp, like it had been made minutes ago. Beside it was another, and another, a trail of prints leading deeper into the forest, away from the trailhead. Jake's throat tightened. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her forward, away from the prints, but she resisted, her feet planted. "We can't keep going that way," she said, her voice trembling. "That's where they're going. Whatever made those." "We don't have a choice," Jake said, his voice low. "The trailhead's back there, somewhere. We keep moving, we'll find it." But as he spoke, he saw more prints, faint but unmistakable, crisscrossing the path ahead. They weren't random. They were leading somewhere, guiding them deeper into the forest, toward the direction of the scream they'd heard the night before. The wind picked up, carrying a faint sound, not a whisper this time, but a low hum, like a voice too distant to understand. Jake's skin prickled, the hairs on his neck standing up. He tightened his grip on Sarah's hand, pulling her along the trail, his eyes scanning for markers, for anything familiar. But the forest was changing, the trees growing denser, the light dimmer, as if the day was slipping away faster than it should. And the footprints were everywhere now, etched into the dirt, a silent promise that whatever had made them was close, watching, waiting for them to follow. The footprints stretched deeper into Blackwood National Park, their uneven, heavy marks etched into the dirt like a path to nowhere, leading Jake and Sarah further from the trailhead they desperately sought. The forest was a labyrinth now, the trail twisting through pines so dense they seemed to swallow the pale midday light. Jake's pack felt like a boulder on his shoulders, his legs burning from hours of walking, but stopping wasn't an option. Not after the abandoned boot, not after the whispers, not after the scream that had torn through the night. Sarah's hand trembled in his, her face pale, her eyes darting to every shadow as the trees closed in. The compass was useless, its needle spinning lazily, and the map, creased and smudged, was a lie, its neat lines mocking the chaotic reality of the forest. They'd fled the clearing with the boot, its cracked leather and frayed laces burned into Jake's memory, a relic of someone who hadn't made it out. The footprints they'd found, too large, too deliberate, had multiplied, crisscrossing the trail, leading deeper into Blackwood's heart. Jake tried to ignore them, to focus on finding the trailhead, but the forest seemed to fight them at every step, the path veering off course, the markers gone. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of pine and something sharper, like rust or blood. The faint hum they'd heard earlier, carried on the wind, had faded, but its absence was no comfort. The forest was watching, waiting, its silence a predator stalking them. Jake's boots crunched on the trail, the sound too loud in the quiet. Sarah was a step behind, her breath ragged, her flashlight still clipped to her belt despite its dead battery. "We're going the wrong way," she said, her voice low, brittle. "Those prints, they're leading us somewhere, Jake. Somewhere we don't want to go." "We're not following them," Jake said, his voice sharper than he meant. He stopped, pulling out the map, though he knew it was useless. The red line of the northern loop should have led them back to the trailhead by now, but the terrain was all wrong, too flat, too dense, no sign of the ravine they'd crossed the night before. "The trailhead's this way. We just need to keep moving." But doubt gnawed at him, the footprints a constant reminder that something else was out here, something that had left that boot behind. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the ground, where another footprint pressed deep into the dirt, its edges fresh, the soil still damp. "That wasn't there before," she whispered, stepping back. "It's following us." Jake's stomach twisted. He wanted to argue, to tell her it was just a trick of the light, but the print was new, its outline sharp, like it had been made moments ago. He grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. "Come on," he said, his voice tight. We don't stop. They moved faster, the trail sloping upward, the trees growing thicker, their branches clawing at the sky. The footprints were everywhere now, scattered along the path, some so deep they looked like they'd been stamped into the earth. Jake's heart pounded, his mind racing to explain them, a hunter, a bear, anything, but nothing fit. The prints were too human, too deliberate, too close. The forest was silent, the usual sounds of birds and squirrels gone, replaced by a stillness that felt alive, predatory. Jake's skin prickled, the hairs on his neck standing up as he scanned the trees for movement. Nothing. Just shadows and pines, their trunks blending into the gloom. He checked his watch, 11:23 a.m. But the time felt meaningless, the light dimmer than it should be, like the forest was swallowing the day. Sarah's steps faltered, her hand slipping from his as she stopped, her eyes wide with panic. "Jake, listen," she said, her voice barely audible. He froze, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing but the faint rustle of the wind. Then it came, the scream. The same raw, desperate sound they'd heard the night before, but closer now, tearing through the forest like a blade. It was ahead of them, somewhere down the trail, rising and falling in a wail of agony that made Jake's blood run cold. Sarah grabbed his arm, her nails digging in, her face drained of color. "That's not an animal," she said, her voice shaking. "That's a person." Jake's mouth was dry, his heart slamming against his ribs. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it was a cougar or an owl, but the scream was too human, too full of pain. It echoed through the trees, louder now, a cry that seemed to pull at them, urging them forward. "We need to go back," Sarah said, pulling at his arm, her eyes wild. "We can't go that way." But Jake looked behind them, where the trail had been, and his stomach dropped. The path was gone, swallowed by a tangle of brambles and roots, the trees so dense they formed a wall. It was as if the forest had closed behind them, cutting off their retreat. "We can't," he said, his voice hollow. "There's no way back." Sarah's breath hitched, her eyes filling with tears. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice breaking. The scream came again, sharper, closer, a sound that clawed at Jake's nerves. It was moving, getting louder, as if whatever was making it was coming toward them. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her forward, toward the scream, though every instinct screamed to run the other way. "We keep moving," he said, his voice trembling. "We find the trailhead. We get out." They ran now, the trail twisting through the forest, the footprints multiplying, leading them deeper into Blackwood. The scream grew louder, a wail that seemed to come from everywhere, filling the air with its raw desperation. Jake's lungs burned, his pack bouncing against his back, but he didn't slow down. Sarah was right beside him, her breaths ragged, her hand gripping his like a lifeline. The trees pressed closer, their branches scraping at their arms, their roots tripping their feet. The trail was barely a path now, a narrow thread through the undergrowth, marked only by the footprints that seemed to guide them. Then, as suddenly as it started, the scream stopped. The silence was worse, heavy and suffocating, like the forest was holding its breath. Jake slowed, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the trees. The trail had opened into another clearing, smaller than the last, with a cluster of rocks at its center, their surfaces slick with moss. The footprints led here, stopping abruptly at the edge of the clearing, as if whatever made them had vanished. Sarah stopped beside him, her breath coming in gasps, her eyes fixed on the rocks. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing. There, half hidden in the grass, was a pile of debris, a torn backpack, its straps shredded, a rusted canteen, a scrap of fabric that might have been a shirt. And beside it, glinting in the dim light, was a knife, its blade dulled by time, its handle cracked. Jake's heart stopped. He stepped closer, his boots sinking into the soft earth, and saw something else, small, white fragments scattered in the grass. Bones. Not animal bones. Too small, too delicate, like they'd been picked clean. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. "Jake," she said, her voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as Jake turned to answer, the wind picked up, carrying a new sound, a low, guttural whisper, not one voice but many, overlapping, coming from the trees. It wasn't a word this time, but a chorus, a sound that crawled under his skin, cold and sharp. The forest wasn't just watching them anymore. It was speaking. The whispers slithered through the trees, a chorus of guttural voices weaving through the dense pines of Blackwood National Park, their words unintelligible but heavy with intent. Jake stood frozen in the small clearing, his boots sinking into the damp earth, his eyes fixed on the pile of debris, torn backpack, rusted canteen, cracked knife, and the scattered bones glinting in the dim light. Sarah's hand was clamped over her mouth, her breath hitching, her body trembling as the whispers grew louder, surrounding them like a living thing. The scream they'd heard minutes ago, raw and human, had stopped abruptly, leaving this new sound in its place, a sound that felt like it was clawing at their minds. The forest wasn't just a forest anymore. It was something else, something that knew they were here. Jake's heart pounded, his pulse a roar in his ears. The clearing was smaller than the one they'd camped in, its edges choked with undergrowth, the rocky outcrop at its center slick with moss and shadow. The footprints they'd followed, large, uneven, too deliberate to be human, ended here, as if whatever made them had vanished into the air. But the whispers told a different story. They were close, coming from the trees, from the ground, from everywhere. Jake's skin prickled, the hairs on his neck standing up as he scanned the clearing, searching for movement, for anything that could explain the bones, the debris, the sounds. Nothing. Just the pines, their branches swaying faintly, and the heavy silence beneath the whispers. Sarah's voice broke through, a choked whisper. "Jake, those are human bones." Her eyes were wide, glistening with tears, her hand still pressed to her mouth as if to keep a scream from escaping. She pointed at the fragments scattered in the grass, small, white, too delicate to belong to an animal. A finger bone, maybe, or a piece of a wrist, picked clean and left to bleach in the sun. The sight made Jake's stomach lurch, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it was a deer or a fox, but the knife, the backpack, the canteen, they weren't the remnants of an animal. They were the remnants of a person. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice rough, barely audible over the whispers. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the edge of the clearing, where the trail should have continued. But the path was gone, swallowed by a wall of ferns and brambles, the trees so dense they seemed to lean inward, blocking their way. He spun around, searching for the trail they'd come from, but it too was gone, the forest rearranged, the ground a tangle of roots and shadows. Panic clawed at his chest. The map in his pocket was useless now, the compass a dead weight, its needle spinning aimlessly. They were trapped. Sarah's breath came in short gasps, her eyes darting from the bones to the trees. "It's not letting us leave," she said, her voice trembling. "The forest, it's keeping us here." "Don't say that," Jake snapped, sharper than he meant. He let go of her arm, his hands shaking as he pulled the map from his pocket, unfolding it in the dim light. The red line of the northern loop stared back at him, mocking him with its simplicity. The trailhead was 6 miles back, a straight shot through the ravine, past the creek where they'd camped. But the ravine was gone, the creek a distant memory, and this clearing wasn't on the map at all. He traced the line with his finger, willing it to make sense, but the forest didn't care about maps. It didn't care about them. The whispers grew louder, a low hum that vibrated in Jake's chest, words forming and dissolving before he could grasp them. Sarah grabbed his sleeve, her nails digging in. "Listen," she said, her voice barely a breath. The hum shifted, becoming a single word, repeated over and over, "Stay." Jake's blood ran cold. He looked at Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She heard it too. The word wasn't just in the wind. It was in the ground, in the trees, in the air, a command that pressed against their skin like a physical force. Jake folded the map, stuffing it back into his pocket. "We're not staying," he said, his voice firm despite the fear coiling in his gut. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the only gap in the trees, a narrow opening where the footprints seemed to lead. The whispers followed, growing sharper, more insistent, as if the forest was angry they were moving. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like blood, the scent stronger now, clinging to the back of Jake's throat. He kept his eyes on the ground, avoiding the bones, the knife, the shredded backpack, but their presence burned in his mind. Someone had been here. Someone who hadn't made it out. The trail, if it could be called that, was barely a path, a thread of dirt winding through the undergrowth, marked by more footprints, fresh and deep, their edges sharp in the soft earth. Jake's heart pounded as he followed them, not because he wanted to but because there was no other way. The trees pressed closer, their branches scraping at his pack, their roots tripping his boots. Sarah was right behind him, her breath ragged, her hand gripping his like a lifeline. The whispers grew louder, a chorus now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from the trees themselves, urging them to stop, to turn back, to stay. They pushed on, the trail sloping downward, the light dimming as the canopy thickened. The forest was changing, the pines giving way to older trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches forming a roof that blocked out the sky. Jake's flashlight was nearly dead, its beam a faint flicker, but he kept it on, the light a small comfort against the growing darkness. Sarah's flashlight was useless, its battery drained in the night, but she clutched it anyway, her knuckles white. The footprints were everywhere now, crisscrossing the path, leading deeper into the forest, toward the source of the scream they'd heard. "Jake," Sarah said, her voice breaking. She stopped, pointing at the ground. Another footprint, larger than the others, pressed deep into the dirt. It was fresh, the soil still damp, and it wasn't theirs. Jake's stomach dropped. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jake said, pulling her forward. "Keep moving." But his mind was racing, the bones and the knife flashing in his memory. The footprint was too big, too heavy, like something massive had stood there, watching them. He didn't want to think about what it could be, didn't want to imagine what could leave a print like that. The whispers were louder now, a constant hum, the words stay repeating like a heartbeat. The forest didn't want them to leave. And as they stumbled deeper into the clearing, the footprints growing fresher, Jake felt the weight of that truth settle over him like a shroud. Something was out there, and it was close. The whispers coiled around Jake and Sarah like smoke, their guttural chorus seeping from the trees of Blackwood National Park, each syllable a cold finger tracing their spines. "Stay." The word pulsed in the air, louder now, as they stood in the clearing littered with relics, a torn backpack, a rusted canteen, a cracked knife, and the bleached human bones scattered like forgotten offerings. Jake's heart hammered, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the footprints that led from the clearing, large and uneven, pressed deep into the earth as if something heavy had dragged itself through the dirt. Sarah's hand trembled in his, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror as the whispers grew sharper, more insistent, a cacophony of voices that seemed to rise from the forest itself. The scream they'd heard earlier, raw and desperate, had stopped, but its absence only deepened the dread, replaced by this relentless murmur that felt like a command. The clearing was a trap, its edges choked with dense pines and brambles, the trail they'd followed swallowed by the forest. Jake's map was useless, its red lines a cruel fiction against the labyrinth of Blackwood. The compass, clipped to his pack, spun aimlessly, its needle mocking their need for direction. The bones at their feet told a story Jake didn't want to hear. Someone had been here, someone who hadn't made it out. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like blood, clinging to the back of his throat. Sarah's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the whispers. "It's watching us, Jake. I can feel it." He didn't answer. He couldn't. The whispers were everywhere, a low hum that vibrated in his chest, words forming and dissolving before he could grasp them. The footprints, fresh and deliberate, led toward the rocky outcrop at the clearing center, its moss-slick surface glinting in the dim light. Jake's flashlight was nearly dead, its beam a faint flicker, but he kept it pointed at the ground, following the prints, though every instinct screamed to run the other way. Sarah clung to his arm, her nails digging in, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling. "Those bones, that knife, we need to go." Jake nodded, his throat tight. He pulled her toward the only gap in the trees, where the footprints seemed to lead, though he knew it was a mistake. The forest didn't want them to leave. The trail, if it could be called that, was a narrow thread of dirt, choked with roots and vines that snagged at their boots. The pines loomed closer, their branches scraping at Jake's pack, their shadows blending into the gloom. The whispers followed, growing louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the ground itself, urging them to stop, to turn back, to stay. Jake's skin prickled, the hairs on his neck standing up as he scanned the trees for movement. Nothing. Just shadows and silence beneath the whispers. They moved quickly, the trail sloping downward, the light dimming as the canopy thickened. The footprints were everywhere now, crisscrossing the path, some so fresh the dirt was still damp. Jake's heart pounded, his mind racing to explain them, a hunter, a bear, anything, but nothing fit. The prints were too large, too human, too deliberate, like something was guiding them deeper into Blackwood's heart. Sarah's steps faltered, her hand slipping from his as she stopped, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Jake," she whispered, pointing. There, in the dirt, was a new print, larger than the others, its edges sharp, the soil disturbed like something had stood there moments ago. Beside it was a patch of flattened grass, as if something heavy had rested there, waiting. Jake's stomach dropped. He knelt, his fingers hovering over the print, not daring to touch it. The dirt was soft, the print deep, like whatever made it weighed far more than a man. He stood, grabbing Sarah's hand, pulling her forward. "Keep moving," he said, his voice low, though he wasn't sure where they were going. The trailhead was supposed to be 6 miles back, but the forest had rearranged itself, the paths twisting, the landmarks gone. The map in his pocket was a lie, the compass a joke, and the whispers were a constant now, a low drone that filled the air, the words stay repeating like a heartbeat. The trail twisted sharply, leading them into a denser part of the forest, where the trees were older, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches forming a roof that blocked out the sky. Jake's flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the gloom. Sarah's flashlight was dead, but she clutched it anyway, her knuckles white, her eyes scanning the shadows. The footprints led deeper, their pattern erratic, some turning back, others veering off into the undergrowth. Jake tried to ignore them, to focus on finding a way out, but the whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the trees themselves, urging them to stop, to listen, to stay. "Jake," Sarah said, her voice breaking. She stopped again, pointing at the ground. Another print, fresher than the last, its edges so sharp it looked like it had been made seconds ago. Beside it was a smear in the dirt, like something had been dragged, leaving a trail of broken grass and scuffed earth. Jake's heart stopped. He looked up, scanning the trees, but the forest was empty, the shadows still. The whispers grew sharper, a single voice rising above the rest, not a word but a sound, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. "We need to go," Jake said, pulling Sarah forward, his voice trembling. They ran now, the trail a blur of dirt and roots, the footprints guiding them deeper, though Jake didn't want to follow. The whispers were a roar, filling the air, pressing against their skin like a physical force. The forest was alive, its branches clawing at their packs, its roots tripping their feet. Sarah's breath was ragged, her hand slipping from his as she stumbled, her flashlight falling to the ground. Jake stopped, grabbing it, but when he looked up, the trail was gone, the footprints leading to a wall of trees so dense it looked impenetrable. Sarah's eyes were wide, her face pale. "It's not letting us leave," she said, her voice barely audible over the whispers. "It's keeping us here." Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. The whispers were everywhere, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the ground, the trees, the air itself. And as they stood there, trapped in the forest's embrace, a new sound joined the whispers, a faint crunch, like a footstep, coming from the shadows just beyond the trees, the crunch of a footstep, heavy and deliberate, cut through the whispers that enveloped Jake and Sarah, a sound so close it seemed to come from just beyond the wall of trees that had swallowed their trail. The dense pines of Blackwood National Park loomed over them, their branches a tangled canopy that choked out the fading light, casting the forest in a perpetual twilight. Jake's heart pounded, his flashlight flickering in his hand, its weak beam barely piercing the shadows. Sarah stood frozen beside him, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with terror as the whispers, "Stay," pulsed like a heartbeat, rising from the ground, the trees, the air itself. The clearing they'd stumbled into, with its relics of bones, a torn backpack, and a rusted knife, was behind them now, but the footprints, large, uneven, too heavy to be human, had led them here, to this dead end where the forest seemed to close in like a living cage. Jake's pack dug into his shoulders, the weight of their gear a constant reminder of how far they were from the trailhead, from safety, from the world outside Blackwood. The map in his pocket was a useless scrap, its neat lines a cruel mockery of the labyrinth they were trapped in. The compass, clipped to his pack, spun aimlessly, its needle caught in an endless dance. The scream they'd heard twice now, raw and human, echoed in Jake's mind, mingling with the footsteps. From the night before, the abandoned boot, the bones, and now these whispers that felt like they were burrowing into his skull. Sarah's hand gripped his, her fingers cold and trembling, her dead flashlight dangling from her belt like a talisman that had failed her. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispers, "it's following us." Her eyes darted to the shadows, where the crunch had come from, a single step that felt like a promise of something worse. The forest was silent again, the whispers softening but not gone, a low hum that vibrated in Jake's chest. He wanted to tell her it was nothing, a deer, a falling branch, but the lie wouldn't form. The footprints they'd followed, fresh and deep, were no animals, and the whispers weren't the wind. Something was out there, something that had left those bones behind, something that wanted them to stay. "We need to find a way out," Jake said, his voice low, rough with fear. He turned, scanning the wall of trees, searching for a gap, a path, anything that could lead them back to the trailhead. But the forest was a fortress, the pines so thick their trunks seemed to merge, their branches a net of shadows. The trail they'd come from was gone, swallowed by brambles and roots, as if the forest had erased it. Jake's flashlight flickered again, its beam dimming, and he cursed under his breath, shaking it, willing it to stay alive. The light was their only defense, a frail shield against the dark. Sarah's breath hitched, her hand tightening on his. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow gap between two pines, where the footprints seemed to lead. The dirt was scuffed, the grass flattened, like something heavy had passed through recently. Jake hesitated, his gut screaming to avoid it, but there was no other way. The whispers grew louder, the words stay sharper now, a command that pressed against his skin like a cold blade. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the gap, though every step felt like a mistake. The path was barely a trail, a thread of dirt winding through the undergrowth, marked by more footprints, their edges fresh, the soil still damp. The trees pressed closer, their branches scraping at Jake's pack, their roots snagging his boots. Sarah stumbled behind him, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The whispers followed, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the ground itself, overlapping, urging them to stop, to turn back, to stay. Jake's skin prickled, the hairs on his neck standing up as he scanned the shadows for movement. Nothing. Just pines and darkness, the forest a living thing that breathed with them. They moved faster, the trail twisting deeper into blackwood, the light dimming as the canopy thickened. The footprints were everywhere now, crisscrossing the path, some turning back, others veering into the undergrowth. Jake tried to ignore them, to focus on finding the trailhead, but the forest seemed to fight them, the path looping back on itself, leading them in circles. He stopped, pulling out the map, though he knew it was useless. The red line of the northern loop was a lie, the clearing with the bones unmarked, the trailhead a distant dream. Sarah stood beside him, her eyes scanning the trees, her breath shallow. "We're not getting out," she said, her voice flat, defeated. "It's not letting us." "Don't say that," Jake snapped, folding the map with shaking hands. "We're close. We have to be." But doubt clawed at him, the footprints a constant reminder that something else was out here, something that had left that boot, those bones, that knife. He grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her forward, following the footprints because there was no other path. The whispers grew louder, a roar now, filling the air with their relentless chant. "Stay. Stay. Stay." The trail opened into another clearing, smaller than the last, its edges choked with brambles, a single gnarled tree at its center, its branches twisted like claws. The footprints led here, stopping abruptly, as if whatever made them had vanished. Jake's flashlight flickered, its beam catching a glint in the grass, another relic, a torn scrap of fabric, stained dark with something that looked like blood. Sarah's breath caught, her hand tightening on his. "Jake," she whispered, pointing to the tree. There, carved into the bark, was a symbol, a jagged circle with lines radiating outward, like a sun or an eye, crude but deliberate. "What the hell is that?" Jake said, his voice trembling. He stepped closer, his flashlight shaking in his hand, the beam illuminating the carving. It was fresh, the wood still pale, the sap glistening like blood. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the tree itself, urging them to stay, to look, to listen. Sarah's eyes were wide, her face pale, her body trembling as she backed away. "We need to go," she said, her voice breaking. "Now." But as Jake turned to answer, the forest answered for him. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single, heavy crunch, right behind them. Jake spun, his flashlight flickering, its beam catching a shadow at the edge of the clearing, tall, too tall, its shape wrong, not human. It moved, stepping into the darkness, and the whispers returned, louder, sharper, a single word now, "Stay." The shadow at the edge of the clearing moved, its shape wrong, too tall, too thin, its edges blurring into the darkness of Blackwood National Park like ink bleeding into water. Jake's flashlight flickered, its dying beam catching the glint of the carved symbol on the gnarled tree, a jagged circle with radiating lines, like an eye staring back. The whispers roared, a deafening chorus of stay that pulsed through the air, the ground, the trees, pressing against Jake and Sarah like a physical force. Sarah's hand was a vice on his arm, her breath a ragged gasp, her eyes wide with terror as the shadow shifted, stepping closer, its form still indistinct but undeniably present. The forest was alive, its pines a cage, its silence a predator that had been stalking them since the first scream tore through the night. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs, his flashlight trembling in his hand, its light barely cutting through the gloom. The clearing was small, choked with brambles, the gnarled tree at its center a twisted sentinel, its carved symbol glistening with fresh sap. The footprints they'd followed, large, uneven, too heavy to be human, ended here, scattered around the tree like a ritual circle. The relics from the previous clearing, the bones, the knife, the torn backpack, were a warning, but this was something else, something final. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blood, the whispers a constant drone, urging them to stay, to surrender, to become part of the forest. Sarah's voice was a choked whisper. "Jake, we can't stay here. Her eyes were fixed on the shadow, which hadn't moved again but loomed at the clearing's edge, its shape shifting in the flickering light. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices, not human, not animal, but something older, something that belonged to Blackwood. Jake's flashlight flickered again, its beam weakening, and he shook it, cursing under his breath. The light was their only shield, a frail barrier against whatever was out there. "We're not staying," Jake said, his voice rough, barely audible over the whispers. He pulled Sarah toward the only gap in the trees, where the footprints seemed to vanish, though every step felt like a descent into a trap. The trail was gone, the forest a wall of pines and brambles, its paths erased as if Blackwood was reshaping itself to keep them. The map in his pocket was a lie, the compass a useless weight, its needle spinning aimlessly. The screams, the footsteps, the boot, the bones, the whispers. They were all pieces of a puzzle Jake couldn't solve, a puzzle that ended here, in this clearing, with that shadow watching. They stumbled through the gap, the branches scraping at their packs, their boots sinking into the soft earth. The whispers followed, a relentless chant, "Stay, stay, stay," each word a cold blade against their skin. The forest was darker now, the canopy so thick it blocked out the sky, the light dimming to a gray haze. Jake's flashlight flickered, its beam a faint glow, and he gripped it tighter, willing it to stay alive. Sarah was right behind him, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts, her hand clutching his sleeve. The footprints were gone, but the ground was disturbed, scuffed and flattened, like something heavy had passed through moments ago. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. She stopped, pointing to the ground. There, in the dirt, was a fresh print, larger than the others, its edges sharp, the soil still damp. Beside it was a smear, like something had been dragged, leaving a trail of broken grass and scuffed earth. Jake's stomach dropped. He scanned the trees. His flashlight shaking, but the forest was empty, the shadows still. The whispers grew sharper, a single voice rising above the rest, not a word but a name, Jake. His blood ran cold. He turned to Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide, and he knew she'd heard it too. "Run," he said, grabbing her hand, pulling her forward. They ran, the trail a blur of dirt and roots, the whispers a roar in their ears. The forest fought them, its branches clawing at their arms, its roots tripping their feet. Jake's flashlight flickered, its beam cutting in and out, plunging them into darkness with every falter. Sarah stumbled, her hand slipping from his, and he stopped, grabbing her arm, pulling her up. "Keep going," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't stop." But the forest wouldn't let them. The trail looped back, leading them to the same clearing, the gnarled tree at its center, the carved symbol glaring like an eye. Jake's heart stopped. They'd run in a circle, the forest bending around them, trapping them. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices calling their names, Jake, Sarah, stay, each syllable a command that pressed against their minds. The shadow was there, at the clearing's edge, taller now, its shape more distinct, its edges jagged, like it was made of the forest itself. Sarah's breath was a sob, her body trembling as she backed away, her eyes fixed on the shadow. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. The flashlight flickered one last time, its beam catching the shadow's form, too tall, too thin, its limbs twisted, its face a void. The whispers roared, a single word now, "Stay," and the shadow moved, stepping into the clearing, its form solidifying in the moonlight. Jake grabbed Sarah, pulling her behind the tree, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. The shadow stopped, its head tilting, as if listening, as if seeing them through the dark. The whispers were a scream now, filling the air, the ground, their minds. Jake's flashlight died, plunging them into darkness, and Sarah's scream tore through the night, blending with the whispers, with the forest, with the thing that stepped closer, its footsteps heavy, deliberate, final. The last sound was their own screams, swallowed by the forest, as Blackwood claimed them.